Hello.
Evening. Oh, no, 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 no. Don't do that.
Okay. Welcome again, everybody, and thanks for staying so late with us. We are going to open this debate on solidarity, of course, a key issue in the European asylum and migration policy. I want also to salute the participants who are far away from us online, just to tell you that we do not forget you, and that, as usual, you will be the first ones receiving the possibility to ask for questions or to make remarks. So we have tonight a panel for the moment made of three speakers. We expect a fourth one, Mr. SIMONAK from the permanent representation of Slovakia to join us. Maybe he is, no, he is online. Okay, excellent. He was supposed, yes, all apologies. You were indeed supposed to be online, my mistake. And thanks a lot for being virtually with us. So we have tonight a panel. I just introduced Mr. Simonak from the representation of Slovakia. Then we have two representatives of the European Commission, Mr. DELACOUR, who is from the unit Return in DG Home, and she will, of course, speak about sponsored return. And then we have Mrs. MULLER-RAPPARD, who is from the unit Asylum, and she is, of course, going to say something about relocation, but also trying to explain in a broader way the problematic of solidarity. And finally, my colleague Florian TRAUNER from the equivalent of the ULB on the Flemish side, which is the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and you see that there is no linguistic barrier between our universities, and we invited Florian, who is researcher professor at the VUB, because he has just published a paper on sponsored return, which I found very interesting, and that's the reason why we have invited him. I'm not going to introduce the subject much further, just to say that actually the issue of solidarity is a quite new one, because it has been neglected, I would say, till the crisis of 2015-16. There was not that much said about solidarity, and actually the view was that Dublin is the cornerstone of the common European asylum system, and actually Dublin is the contrary of solidarity. It is a rule, of course, of responsibility. We had then the crisis, and after the crisis, the issue of solidarity came up on the political agenda and is now one of the most important ones, and probably also one of the most difficult ones. I have tried to help you to understand a little bit the problematic, not about the asylum and migration management regulation, where you have provisions on solidarity that are honestly, even for lawyers, almost unreadable. Extremely complex, extremely long. Maybe we will have some explanations about the key elements tonight, but it's really difficult to digest what is proposed by the Commission, at least from the institutional point of view. It's easier about the components and the idea that solidarity is now mandatory, which is a very important, interesting element, but also flexible. And we will see what does it mean, flexible, on the basis of different elements. I have tried here to put on the table the different types of solidarity that one can imagine, starting with the normative solidarity, which is actually legislative harmonization. Why is this a form of solidarity? Well, because it sets a minimum under which it is not possible to go. Member states cannot compete by lowering the standards below the level of the directives. Then the second type of solidarity is financial, redistributing funding between the member states, and this is, of course, done by EU funding and different types of funds, knowing that, of course, this is, for the moment, very limited form of solidarity, because the money which is distributed by the European Union is, of course, very little compared to the budget of each member state, which is devoted to asylum and migration. The third form of solidarity is what I call the operational, you could also say technical solidarity. It is support which is given in kind to the member states, and of course the best known form is the work done by EU agencies like Frontex or like the European Asylum Support Office. We will soon have to say the European Asylum Agency. Those agencies, they are there to help the member states, and that's a very important type of solidarity. And indirectly, actually, it's also a financial solidarity, because EU agencies are funded by the European budget, so indirectly it is money given to the member states benefiting from the agencies. And then the last type of support is physical solidarity, referring to the relocation of asylum seekers or of beneficiaries of international protection, who in that system of relocation are redistributed between member states on the basis of a certain number of criteria. And we have already discussed what happened with the two relocation decisions of September 2015 and the difficulties. Even if it works to a certain extent, we don't have to be certainly not too negative about the way finally relocation worked, but this is certainly the more difficult type of solidarity, because moving persons is extremely difficult. You have to convince those persons, and that's of course an extremely difficult issue, in particular if you want actually to force them to be relocated. You have also, and we have discovered that this is not always that easy to convince the member state of relocation to accept those persons, and there are some exceptions of member states, not that much, a minority, but who nevertheless a strong minority opposed to the idea of relocation. And this is much more difficult actually than operational and financial solidarity, that are a bit hidden forms of solidarity, certainly less politicized and easier to implement. But tonight we are not going to discuss that much those two types of solidarity. We are going more to focus on relocation and on sponsored return. So I don't go further. I just wanted to help you a little bit to clarify what is at stake with this debate, and I leave immediately the floor to my colleague Florian TRAUNER for a presentation of 10-15 minutes, really maximum.
Okay, thank you. I've actually prepared a PowerPoint. Great. How do you start it? Here? Very good. So first of all, let me say thank you. It's a big pleasure to be here. The Odysseus Summer School is really a flagship initiative in the field of asylum, and it's a big honor to be here and to present a research paper which I co-authored with Olivier Sundsberg-Diez. It was published as a policy brief with the European Policy Center. We also submitted it right now to a journal. If it's not rejected, let's hope it will come out in September or so. How do I go further? Yeah, so what we tried in this paper is to really look at return sponsorship, basically what's in a name, a concept that has been coming out relatively innovative from the new pact. It's probably several other elements of the pact. They are known to a certain extent. They have been a bit, reformulated, adjusted, but they're there. But return sponsorship is something really relatively new. So we tried what is it and can it actually work in practice? So let's embed the concept of return sponsorship in the Commission's idea on in the Pact on Asylum and Migration. As you know, it was published last September. It should provide a new start for EU policy making in the field of migration and asylum. The EU moved away from or the Commission moved away from the idea of having mandatory relocation. It said right now member states may be able to choose between different forms of solidarity. It should be more flexible, but it should be mandatory. And notably, they could choose between the relocation of asylum seekers or taking responsibility for returning irregular migrants or rejected asylum seekers, which is then called return sponsorship. There have been a few other elements in the pact. Several elements concerned action directly at the border, so there should be much more happening there. Accelerated procedure, quicker decision making. People should be returned more immediately after arrival if they found ineligible to stay. So a lot of things are happening directly on in these border procedures. And then finally, the EU says we have to engage much stronger and much more intensively with third countries. So third countries should cooperate more, and if they don't do so on the basis of positive incentives, so more money, closer cooperation, they may face also negative consequences of the actions. And the Commission particularly refers to the visa policy here. So the visa code permits right now to impose restrictive measures in case a country is found to cooperate not enough on return. So that's some of the key elements there. To understand return sponsorship, how is it happening in practice? Let's case the example. A group of Nigerian migrants is to be returned directly from Sicily. Belgium is saying, okay, they take responsibility for this group of migrants. So Italy remains in the beginning responsible. They issue the documents needed for return procedure in the first months. They really have the key responsibilities. The European Commission, concretely a return coordinator, a newly created position, tries to coordinate between Italy and Belgium. So they ask, what can we do? How can we help? So they could ask, get the laissez-passer documents, sponsor, for instance, assisted voluntary return program, whatever. It depends on the situation. If a return is possible, within the first 8 months, they are returned immediately from Sicily. If a return is not possible for one or another reason, this group of migrants will be brought to Belgium. The authority shifts to the Belgian authorities, and Belgium may continue returning them from Belgium, or they start a regularization process according to national rules or a toleration regime, whatever. So that's a bit the different scenarios. The whole time frame may change to 4 months in the Commission's idea if there are high migratory pressures. That's the key ideas. Frontex takes a very important role as well in terms of operationalizing the returns, but that's the key pillars basically of the return concept. To say a bit of a word on the background, why coming up with such an idea, such a concept. First idea or first background is that asylum numbers, asylum applications in the EU have fluctuated, implying that some member states have had much higher asylum applications than others. So here you see a slide for a few selected member states. The blue color is Germany. So Germany, under the crisis, they had the highest numbers in absolute terms. In relative terms, it was other countries. It was Sweden, and right now it's Malta. And even for Germany, it really went down right now. It's no longer so much an outsider. You can see that the numbers for Italy, for Spain, also for Greece, they increased quite a bit in recent years. Other states, for instance, Hungary had 177,000 asylum applications during the migration crisis. Last year, they had 150, so basically hardly anyone. So you have very diverging numbers of asylum seekers, and the asylum system attributes responsibility, who is responsible for this, but it does not really have a mechanism for finding solidarity or finding more equal numbers across the member states. So in the crisis, the European Union came up with this emergency relocation scheme, up to 160,000 asylum seekers in the beginning. Later it was reduced. It was seen that there is less of a need then. But here are some of the numbers. You can see in total it was around 34,000 asylum seekers being relocated under this emergency scheme. You can also see that some member states basically fulfilled the quota, some overfulfilled the quota attributed by the Commission to them. Others didn't do any relocations. In some states, it was a very public issue. In Hungary, you had even a national referendum on the issue of relocations. Some other states did very little relocations. So you can say that relocations of asylum seekers in the European Union has been very contested and has been the reason why the Dublin IV proposal has failed, basically. In the Dublin IV proposal, the Commission wanted to move from an emergency to a permanent relocation mechanism, and this was found unacceptable by a number of member states. The third challenge is that third countries do not cooperate in many cases to a very high extent with the EU in returns. So this is another research project we have been doing. So we were gathering return numbers for the whole world over 11 years. Here you see the results. So you can see the darker it is, the more they cooperate on return. The lighter it is, the less cooperation is there. So you have some regions in Africa, for instance, in Asia that have very low return numbers. You have higher return numbers among richer democracies, let's say so. But from the European Union perspective, the whole picture was unsatisfactory, saying that there should be much higher return rates for different countries than the, let's say, average 38, 36% that have characterized the return numbers for many or for the whole world on average. But with many states, it's not much more than 10, 12%. So the question then, with this context, can it work? I mean, the political logic is somehow understandable from the Commission side, saying there is a need. You identify the third countries are not doing enough. You see that in the EU, it's contested. Daniel Thüm in an Odysseus blog has called it's a classical realpolitik approach. So there is some logic behind, but the question is really, will this work in practice? And we can already see in the first months of negotiating, it's complicated. Let's say it like this. So the political fault line have shifted between states with high numbers, states at the borders, and some other states, notably the Visegrad countries, but not only them. You had also Austria, Denmark, and a few other states who have been very critical about any relocation. You have statements such as this returning irregular migrants is a kind of a relocation through the back door. So the demand of these states is there should not be any mandatory relocation of returnees within the European Union, and they want to get rid of this obligation in the negotiations. By contrast, the southern member states said 8 months is a very long time period. It should be more a standard 4 months, and if not possible, even reduced to 2 months. So much quicker procedures to bring migrants away from their countries, and much harder obligations that there are actually tangible and predictable forms of solidarity from northern member states that are not the first countries of interest in the European Union. So that is one of the political divides. You could say that the debates of the relocation have shifted, but they are not completely gone away. The second way is, and here the Commission has always been very outspoken, it should be flexible. There is very little obligations for states. They can choose the nationalities they want to return. They can choose which form of solidarity they show, more relocation, more return sponsorship, and so on. De facto, if you really scratch on the surface, you can see that there's so much flexibility that it's really difficult for border countries to say what will actually come out of this whole process. And we have, for instance, interviewed an Italian official. They said, for instance, a Valletta initiative, which is based entirely on voluntariness. So the Valletta initiative is done between a few member states and Italy, saying that ship migrants coming to migrants will be relocated voluntarily to other member states, so to avoid the politicization of ship arrivals. They say basically this is voluntarily, but presumably it may even provide more and stronger solidarity than with this concept that involves a lot of negotiations, a lot of ad hoc finding balances, a lot of discussions. What is actually a good balance? What is solidarity? Other challenges are or concern migrants themselves. In the European Union, you don't have a common understanding, or you don't have you don't have a real harmonization on many aspects of the return policies. You can see this right now. Denmark has been in the media recently. They started to returning migrants to Syria in the region of the capital, Damascus, and others. Other states return a lot to Afghanistan. In some member states, Afghan returns are forbidden by courts. So you have very different return practices, very different perceptions of what is safe. And it's not completely clear how the return sponsorship will fall squarely there. It's relatively possible that there are new vulnerabilities for migrants being affected by this concept of return sponsorship if it is implemented. And the final point is that the question of third countries, the European Commission puts a lot of hope on more and stricter conditionality, but from everything what we have seen in the last 20 years, third countries are not easily forced to cooperate more. We have seen several states in which there was public manifestations after return flights arriving from Europe. Democracies in Africa face huge pressure not to cooperate with the EU. It's often seen as a betrayal of the interest of their own populations. So it's relatively unsecure to what extent this will play out. Another challenge there is that to make it work, you will really have to rely on some member states with particular ties with African countries. Just to give you a number, Jean-Pierre Casarino created this database on bilateral return readmission agreements. And in this database, it stated that 70% of all readmission agreements with African countries are done by only 3 states, Italy, France, and Spain. So all the other states have really to build somehow the leverage this kind of, EU member states with particular close socioeconomic ties with African states are able to have. Another question is, a state such as France, for instance, they have big counterterrorism operations in the Sahel, and they may perceive that the security and foreign policy priorities, they may even be more important than using the leverage they have on these states just to cooperate, to make them cooperate on return with let's say, Poland or Germany or whatever. So it will rely a lot of goodwill of member states to make it work, and it will rely a lot of goodwill of third countries that is not a given, we believe. So to come to the conclusion already, can I go back? So the point of departure from the Commission's perspective, and as I said, I think it's not an unlogical conclusion as such, return is the missing piece. Some countries, notably the Visegrad countries, has called for years and years for very restrictive policies. So let's give them responsibilities for restrictive policies. Let's give them in charge, or let's put them in charge of the return field. So it's a realpolitik approach. It's something that may, from a bird eye perspective, lead to more cooperation among member states. The real challenge is that it has high stakes. It may not reduce the level of politicization of the cooperation on migration in the EU. It will increase the stakes for migrants, and it may have negative implications for the EU's cooperation with third countries. And de facto, given that it's relatively flexible, the operational gains may be overstated as well. So there's a big risk that it's not working as smoothly as the inventors may have thought so. But I'm happy to be contradicted by my fellow speakers on this. I will stop here already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are you going to take the floor, Mrs. MULLER-RAPPARD, please?
Okay. So I wanted to take a step back and talk about the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation proposal, and specifically on the chapter on solidarity, which comprises return sponsorship. And then my colleague who deals more particularly with returns will respond, I think, in that context. So I wanted to try and simplify the complex system and give you an outline of how it works. And I wanted to touch upon both substance and the process. I'm relatively new to the Commission, and I know that from the outside it's sometimes a bit opaque about what the Commission is doing as a body. And I wanted to give you a few insights on how it works in practice in terms of the negotiations. So if I start on substance, the pact generally was the result of in-depth consultations and also taking stock of failures in past negotiations and also in the current situation. So taking into consideration the way Dublin is working or not working today, and the fact that there are arrivals impacting a few member states at the external borders, the idea is to totally review the balance between responsibility and solidarity. Now tonight I'm only going to talk about the solidarity aspects, but you really have to keep in mind that you can't look at solidarity in isolation. You also have to look at the responsibility, what we call the burden of member states of first arrival, and that is in the new pact, the screening, the mandatory border procedure, and in some cases responsibility for the examination of the applications. So the idea is to, as I said, also take stock of the discussions and the failure of the proposals to have mandatory relocations, and therefore to propose a system that is indeed more flexible for member states, but that is still mandatory. So the provision of solidarity will be mandatory, but there will be flexibility on the type of solidarity measures and in some instances on the level of the contributions. So I'm going to distinguish between the solidarity mechanism for disembarkations following search and rescue operations. So that's one mechanism which I'm going to call the SAR mechanism. And then there is a slightly different mechanism for member states under pressure. So there are a lot of common aspects between the two, but it's important to distinguish them. So to give you a broad overview before I start separating between the two, there are three different types of solidarity measures. There's relocation, which we've touched upon, i.e. Migrants, I'm going to say migrants more generally, but then I'll refine, are relocated from one member state to another member state. The scope of the relocation, i.e. whether it's asylum applicants or beneficiaries or even other third country nationals, it depends on the situation, okay? But so the one broad category is relocation. Another broad category is return sponsorship, and my colleague will get back to that and respond to a few points. And then the third category is what we call other measures, and that is capacity building measures, operational support, and measures in the external dimension. And we can talk about examples afterwards if you have specific questions, but the idea is for member states who do not or cannot relocate or provide return sponsorship, to give another option for the benefiting member states, which is sending staff, financing projects, or even financing projects in a third country that affects migration flows in the benefiting member state. So those are the three broad categories, but they play out differently depending on whether we're under the SAR mechanism or under the pressure mechanism. So now I'm moving to the, that was the type of contribution. So those are the three measures, the three solidarity measures. And then there is the level of contributions, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but you have to know that we have proposed a distribution key, which is dependent on population and GDP. It's based on the previous Eurostat data, so for example 2019 or 2020 data, and on the basis of this formula we calculate a fair share for each member state. So each member state can calculate its own fair share for a given year, and that will be a percentage. The total of the 27 equals 100%. And each member state knows its fair share, i.e. how much it should contribute in terms of solidarity measures. And that is, as I'll explain in a second, the fallback calculation for the level of contributions. So you have the type of contributions and the level of contributions. So now moving to the SAR mechanism. So for disembarkations following search and rescue operations, which today work on a voluntary basis from Italy and Malta mainly. The idea here is to have an ex ante system. So the idea is for the Commission on a yearly basis, with help of various agencies, reports, etc., to have projections on the number of disembarkations for the following year. And on that basis, to ask member states to contribute with either relocations or capacity building measures. So those are the two categories which are available under the search and rescue regime. So member states can choose which type, how they're going to contribute. So as I said, either relocations or these capacity building measures. And they put forward in a first step on a voluntary basis the level of their contributions. And it's only if the levels are deemed insufficient by the Commission compared to their projections that the Commission can step in and request the member states to adapt their contributions in terms of the level to correspond to the fair share. So at the beginning, the process is totally voluntary. It's always voluntary in terms of the choice of the type of measures, and the level is only adapted by the Commission to the fair share if the member states are very much below the needs that have been identified by the Commission in advance on a yearly basis. There's a mechanism throughout the year to adjust the level of contributions depending on the number of disembarkations, but I'm not going to go into this. Now I'm going to move to the pressure mechanism. So the pressure mechanism is not ex ante, but if you want ex post. So it can be triggered either by the Commission or by a member state. So a member state can say, I'm under migratory pressure, I'm not managing anymore. Or the Commission can say, I think you, member state, are not managing anymore. The Commission does a very in-depth analysis of the situation in that member state and will take into account both quantitative and qualitative criteria to determine whether the member state is under migratory pressure. The list of criteria is very long. There are a lot of indicators which are taken into account. It's not only arrivals, it's also applications, it's returns, it's transfer decisions, it's the number of beneficiaries in the member state. So there are a lot of criterion indicators that are taken into account, but also reports from the agencies, from the member state itself, from the awareness system that the Commission has. So a lot of information is taken into account to evaluate the capacity of the member state in question and the needs. If the member state is indeed considered to be under pressure, the Commission will indicate solidarity measures in the 3 categories this time. So for SAR, you only had relocation and capacity measures. For the member state under pressure, you have 3 possibilities from the outset. So relocation, return sponsorship, and the capacity building measures. And again, it calls the member states to choose with which measures the member states wants to contribute to the solidarity efforts. But this time, the level is set according to the distribution key. Now, in both cases, so both for SAR and for pressure, there is safety net to ensure that the benefiting member states will have a minimum level of relocation in the case of SAR, or relocation and return sponsorship in the case of pressure. So there's a certain threshold that has to be met, and if that threshold is not met, member states who have participated with capacity building measures will be obliged to also contribute with either relocation or return sponsorship. So again, here the Commission intervenes and steers the member state, but the member state always has the choice between at least 2 measures under any circumstance. And this is the flexibility, the kind of overarching principle in this solidarity mechanism to make sure, we hope, that member states are going to buy into the system and accept the proposal for this mandatory solidarity mechanism. There is yes. So just to come back to these 3 measures, the aim is to try and cover various needs. And here, if you consider the situation of the EU member states, they are in very different situations. They're the member states of first arrival that are obviously impacted by search and rescue operations or arrivals from neighboring third countries. But the member states are also impacted differently depending on the nature of the arrivals and the nationality of arrivals. So there are some member states that have more, let's say, to simplify, economic migrants, which are less likely to be granted international protection and therefore have a higher number of returnees. And other member states have a higher number of asylum applicants, which are likely to be granted international protection, who will become beneficiaries and will have to be integrated into society. There are also other member states who today have a lot of what we call secondary movements, so applicants that come from other EU member states, or who come or who are visa-free applicants, or visa overstayers. So each member state is impacted by migration in a different way. And the idea with these 3 types of measures is to cover these different scenarios. So the relocation is, I'd say, targeted to applicants for international protection and also beneficiaries of international protection in certain cases. Return sponsorship will be targeted for member states that have more returnees. And capacity building is across the board and can cover any particular needs that a member state may have in terms of capacity of their reception or asylum system. Okay. Then I can respond to any questions you have on substance later, but just to move on, I wanted to say a few words on process. Everything that the two of us are going to talk about is obviously a proposal, and the proposal is under discussion and under heavy discussion, I would say. So we have two tracks in parallel, as you know, with the co-legislators. So there's one track with the Council, Member States, and one with the European Parliament. So for the AMR, so the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation proposal, for the time being, we have gone through the whole text, article by article, with the Member States. And we have done a first reading. So that means we've been through the text in its entirety once. And it's been quite a long process because there are very complex provisions, a lot of new concepts such as return sponsorship and all these solidarity provisions. There are also changes to the Dublin III system. And so this is my personal view, but I think this first reading has taken quite some time, and it was more really to go through the proposal for member states to understand exactly how it worked and to try and convey to them or to allow them for each member state to see how the text would impact them, as I said, in situations that are very different from one member state to the other. The positions are very different on several topics. To give you an example, the existence of a separate mechanism for SAR is something that member states are very divided on. Whether relocation should be mandatory or not. So I've told you solidarity is mandatory, but not relocation. So member states always have a choice between the measures. But some member states, in particular the Med 5, consider that relocation should be mandatory, that's the main measure. The scope of relocation, so who should the relocation cover, what category of migrants, and how the fair share is calculated. So these are the main points today in the discussions that we've had so far, which are really points of disagreement between member states, or where we see very extreme positions. I think you mentioned the various categories of member states. So there's the Med 5, Austria and Denmark have similar positions. France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany are more in favor of supporting relocation. So there are very different political positions. But I think because some of these positions are so extreme, a compromise is maybe more likely to some degree on some aspects. In the European Parliament, it's a very different situation because we don't have the representation is different since it's political parties. And here the concerns more about border management, returns, that's one focus. Another focus is fundamental rights, guarantees throughout the whole procedures, so that the focus is a bit different. And with the Parliament at technical level, we've also been through a complete reading of the text, and the rapporteur for the proposal will issue a report in September. So that's where we are now. As you know, we've just switched today from the Portuguese presidency to the Slovenian presidency, and the Slovenian presidency will continue the meetings at technical and political level to discuss both solidarity, responsibility, and the border procedures more or less in parallel, since, as I said, you have to take into account that responsibility and solidarity are really linked in all the discussions, whether it's for the member states or the Parliament, and so these have to go in parallel to the extent possible. So I'm really available to take questions later, but I think we should move back to return sponsorship.
Thanks a lot indeed for this clarification. It helps us, I hope, a little bit to understand this complex proposal. And now, Mrs. Delacour, we are ready to listen to you about return sponsorship.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having us here on this very interesting debate. I'll try and go a little bit to give our perspective of how we see sponsorship, and also perhaps to start a bit with how we got there, how we put return sponsorship into this. I think Alex explained very well the different needs that member states have, and I think this is something we have seen quite clearly from the 2016 reform, and how that has evolved, and the discussions that the needs are very different, and there are different member states are under pressure for different reasons. And I think in that context, this is where the idea of return sponsorship came in as a new element to add a bit into the mix. And this is also, of course, I think what's important perhaps as a first thing to say is that all these issues, they're not in isolation. They're all part of the pact, of the whole architecture of the new sort of fresh approach on migration. So they're all building blocks and pieces. So this is all elements that have to sort of work together in order to make the whole system work. I think that the idea of return sponsorship, just as Alex explained, there are certain member states who have a very high number of migrants who need to be returned, and that's they don't need relocation, because these are not people who have the right to stay in that sense. So that's where we needed to add another piece to the puzzle, and I think there is no secret that returns from the EU are very difficult. For the moment, return rates are at around 30%, so only a third of those who actually get a negative decision or who have a return decision actually return. So adding this concept of sponsorship is in one way a new element of solidarity, but also a way to actually step up returns within the EU, which is something we really need, because if returns don't work, there is no capacity to deal with those who need protection. And it's also a way to discourage irregular migration, because if it's clear that you can never be returned in any way, then irregular migration will still continue. So this is really part of the whole puzzle and the architecture. Return sponsorship often is said to be complex. I've heard it, a very complicated concept. In a way, it's simple. It's about one member state providing support to another member state in order to return a person. Now, yes, there's a lot of flexibility built into this mechanism because the needs are different. We have different nationalities, different individual needs. Every member state have different aspects of the process that they may need help with. And that's a little bit the key of the design. So I think this is, it's important to bear this in mind, because this is really part of why there is so much flexibility in this process, is that we want to make it something that will actually work. Professor de BRUYCKER, he mentioned in the beginning the different types of solidarity: financial, operational, and physical solidarity. So I'll leave you to ponder where you want to put sponsorship in there, because it can fit into different categories. But of course, yes, it's a very innovative concept, but so was relocation a couple of years ago. It was something that has never been done. And I remember the first relocations that we did, I was in DG Home at the time, and it was this was something that we started with a few flights, and there were many questions of how it would work, how would member state cooperate, but little by little the procedure was put in place. And this is a little bit what we hope will happen with sponsorship, that once the legislative text is agreed, we will have to make it work in practice. Where, of course, the complexity, it will not be simple, because if you look at the different types of sponsorship, I might want to say a few words first about that. I mentioned that it's quite open. If you look in the proposal, there's a list of different examples that member states can provide as support. For instance, a person that needs to be returned needs to be counseled. You need to accompany this person. Someone needs to actually sit with this person, explain the different rights, procedures, what will happen. There's a need to design a sort of package for the person to return, because we don't just send people back without anything. There's a process, there's a return. We have quite well-developed reintegration programs, because the idea is also, if you return someone, is that that person should have some perspective when the person comes back. The different migrants that need to be returned have different vulnerabilities that need to be taken into account, and this might require an expertise that Member State A does not have, but Member State B might be very, very experienced with dealing with a type of vulnerability and might be able to help that Member State A, who for some reason might have 5 migrants in that vulnerable category to help with. So this is a little bit the idea. We often speak about that it's about a lot of the support could be to convince a third country to cooperate on the actual return processes and to help with these laissez-passer, as Florian mentioned in the beginning. And that's one piece of the support, but there are also other parts of it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about the démarche with the third country. It can also be, many member states have these assisted voluntary return programs. That's part of a machinery that they, where they have a certain amount of places on a flight, and they can open up those places to other member states, or they can help to charter a plane, or they can help with the logistics around those things. And yes, this is very flexible, and this will be very complex to organize and to ensure the fairness in the level. But this is precisely why we've also proposed this new role of this return coordinator, because this is precisely what we think that person could do, to discuss and see with member states and make sure that this is done in a balanced way. But the concept in itself is simple. It's one member state helping another member state with one person and making sure that that person actually returns. I think Florian mentioned a little bit about the vulnerabilities, and I wanted to say a few words on that, because that's of course one of the key aspects where we are very conscious about the protection of the rights. That's one of the fundamental values, of course, of the European Union, and the protection of rights is a very important aspect of the whole pact, and the protection of vulnerables in particular. The article on return sponsorship doesn't mention much about rights or anything like that. It just refers essentially to the rights and obligation under the return directive. And this is because return sponsorship in itself is not affecting the way the procedures on return are set up in the EU, because the rights and obligation under the return directive and return legislation, this sort of stays with the country where the migrant is. So this doesn't shift in any way. It doesn't shift. It shifts when, after 8 months, the person has not actually been returned, then member states, the member state that is sponsoring that person will be transferred to the member state that is sponsoring, and then that member state will take over the responsibilities. But under the whole process, both member states need to whenever they're responsible, apply the return directive in full with all the safeguards. I think you mentioned the returns to Syria and the different sort of approaches that member states have. Of course, with the whole, we aim with the whole reform to harmonize and to have as much as sort of equal level. But on this particular part, in terms of return sponsorship, for instance, if member state A does not return to Afghanistan, those migrants will not be part of return sponsorship, because they will not be in the return process at all. So in principle, and it doesn't matter if member state B says they want to return Afghani nationals, because if member state A doesn't have those in the return procedure, then they cannot enter into that machinery at all. So I think that's an important part to bear in mind in this thing. In terms of cooperation with third countries, of course, readmission and cooperation with third countries is difficult. And yes, we might get into situations where a third country all of a sudden refuses to cooperate because they do not want to necessarily discuss with member state that member state A is discussing on behalf of member state B. But there are various reasons why third countries don't cooperate, and the objective a little bit of the whole proposals and everything that is part of the pact is really to sort of create the EU leverage. And that's precisely, you mentioned the measures under the visa code, and those are very important in this concept, because that's where we will come in and sort of from an EU perspective try to leverage a third country to cooperate. So on these things, yes, we may run into difficulties with some, but we might actually gain with others. So it's a little bit of in that sense, we're hoping that it will be rather a gain, and that we're joining forces as the EU as a whole in order to sort of step up our returns collectively. So it's really a way to together do more on returns. So I think I will limit myself to that. That's a little bit what I wanted to say, but I'm of course happy to take your questions you may have on this.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Now we turn to Mr. SIMONAK from the Slovakian representation. Let me just say before he takes the floor that actually we wanted, of course, to have a balanced panel, and that we wanted to invite one of the MEDA 5 member states, but this has unfortunately not been possible. So we listen tonight to the position of one member state representing more or less a certain group, but please keep in mind, of course, that there are other views of, in particular, the Mediterranean member states. Mr. SIMONAK, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening to all. I hope you can hear me well. It's really a privilege to take the floor today. I do apologize. It's really a privilege to take the floor here in this round. Following the previous distinguished speakers, there's really a lot that I was intending to say, but I'm going to leave out for fear of repeating what has been said. My remarks tonight are indeed made in my private capacity. I do not have any specific mandate, so please bear that in mind. They reflect my views. My name is Vladimir SIMONAK. I have been, as already said, active with the Slovakian permanent representation in the Home Affairs field for 6 years now. I've been more or less in charge of the European affairs of the Slovakian Interior Ministry since 2011. So there is a bit of memory that I would like to share with you, and obviously I will be looking forward to the to comments and questions you might have. First, perhaps I would like to make a few general comments on solidarity in asylum, and just to supplement what has been said by previous speakers. Indeed, the idea that solidarity should be a firm component of asylum policy has not been a mainstream idea for long. I mean, if you look at Dublin from its roots in the Schengen Convention, it has never been construed as a solidarity mechanism. It has always been construed as a mechanism to assign responsibility, and particularly to limit and discourage secondary flows of migrants. I have, in my practice, noticed an increasing pressure on mainstreaming the solidarity component in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, if I have to be very clear and honest. In 2011, I remember the first relocation effort organized by under European flag, which was a project called EUREMA. It was relocation of people from Malta, particularly Libyan migrants arriving in large numbers, relatively large numbers, in Malta. And this project has been, I think, very instructive when it comes to limitations of relocations as an instrument. And I wish it had been examined more carefully, to be honest, in the later years. Professor de BRUYCKER has, in the beginning, shown a table indicating possible kinds of solidarity, if you like. I'm not necessarily disputing that. Actually, I think it's a pretty good overview that we've been given. But maybe as a fuel for thought or food for thought, I would like to point to a document which has been half forgotten by now, and I consider it to be worthy of more attention that it has received. It is, what I mean are council conclusions adopted on the 8th of March 2012 under a title which is an excellent example of council drafting habits. It says, Council conclusions on a common framework for genuine and practical solidarity towards member states facing particular pressures on their asylum systems, including through mixed migration flows. So easily can be found by just Googling it, adopted on the 8th of March 2012, and includes no less than, I think, 8 separate categories of solidarity measures. I have to say that from today's perspective, they reflect the spirit of the time, perhaps better than anything else, but may be worth recommending to the attention of anybody studying solidarity thinking in EU migration policy. Now, what we now call the Juncker package of 2016, the package of legislative proposals, which ultimately have not fared too well. I think the actually revolutionary idea included in this package, in terms of solidarity, was the concept of fair share. Basically, what the Juncker package was based on was the idea that there is an ideal share of asylum seekers between member states. That share is not reflected in the actual lodging of asylum applications. So administrative tools need to be deployed in order to make reality match the ideal assigned share. This share obviously was then based on the key combining GDP and population size of member states. And it has really been a remarkable departure from the debate on solidarity as it had been until now. The debate until then, I'm sorry. Before 2016, the debate of solidarity was how to support member states facing exceptional pressure. In 2016, the Commission's proposals actually made it a debate about how to reassign asylum seekers within the EU according to a blueprint, which is a conceptually very different issue. Now, on this concept of fair share, I would like to point out one remarkable thing. It has, to my knowledge, this concept of fair share itself has, to my knowledge, never been discussed at a political level between member states. I am not aware of any council debate or indeed European Council debate which had been specifically dedicated to the idea, do member states accept that asylum seekers should be assigned to them according to a fair share, however calculated. This has never occurred to my knowledge, and I would really love to be corrected if anyone is aware of that. In the course of that debate in 2016, there was also a first emergence of the idea of return sponsorships. It wasn't called that at that point. In 2016, it was called relocations for return. And I was personally involved in developing that idea because I was, as every presidency, in the second half of 2016, Slovakia had the council presidency. I was then faced with the problem of the blank piece of paper, which I had to fill with ideas that were meant to break deadlocks in negotiations, which was, let's say, not really a resounding success in the end. But yes, what was developed ultimately in the cooperation with some colleagues was what Professor TRAUNER has very fittingly called a realpolitik approach to the whole thing. Relocations for return have obviously been politically more palatable to some governments rather than others. So yeah, as the motto goes, so let's be united in diversity and see whether, you know, we can use this as a basis for helping each other. One of the most frustrating experiences that I have had in that course was how little attention that concept gathered in 2016. And indeed, I think there was one delegation in the council which has, I think, properly understood the intent behind that idea at the time. The debate at the time was so heavily focused on the Commission's proposal, and particularly the concept of fair share. So it was a problem of a proposal that sort of fell in the middle between the camps of member states, some for whom there was too much relocation in the concept, and others where there was too little relocation or too little solidarity. So it sort of was a proposal that failed to satisfy either part of the debate as it was then going on. On the pact, I mean, on the current proposals of the Commission, indeed, I think a very distorted view would emerge if we discussed its separate elements. It's so interconnected, and in the end, I think it is really a package. It is really a package of proposals that needs to be understood as one whole. But I think the concept of if I focus specifically on the concept of return sponsorships, I think the colleague from the Commission has described it excellently, way better than I could. I think it sort of shares the sad fate of relocations for return in 2016. Those member states who are expected to benefit from return sponsorships are, in my perception, are quite critical of the burden that the mechanism places on them. I have heard voices saying that the burden that they need to bear, the member states of first arrival, the burden that they need to bear in return sponsorships actually heavier than the one that they would bear in receiving other forms of solidarity. And yes, and all other member states indeed are critical, as Professor TRAUNER has recalled in the quote of the Austrian Interior Minister, Mr. Nehammer, saying that this is perceived to be relocation by backdoor. So quite sadly, I have to say that this concept again has been, yes, a bit not understood fully, and has been the sort of the victim of trying to satisfy both sides of the debate at the same time, which in general, I personally am also attached to thinking is a very commendable objective, and I really don't believe I would have not floated that idea if I had a choice again. And lastly, speaking about return sponsorships and asylum system in general, yes, what the colleagues from the Commission have already said, the willingness of third countries to readmit their own nationals is in many ways the first and last point to be analyzed. And it is a problem that I'm not going to describe in more details than that it has already been done. But I think it also points to a vulnerability that we as the EU have in our asylum system. If you look at what the guy who calls himself the president of Belarus these days, what he's organizing on the Lithuanian border, it very clearly shows how much exposed we are to any sort of lack of cooperation of third countries, including wholesale weaponization of migration, which is what's happening at the Belarusian-Lithuanian border. So this is, I think, something that should be taken into account when discussing any aspect of the asylum system, including, the solidarity aspects. But yes, I don't think I can demand any more of your time on this. So thank you for your attention. Obviously, looking forward to any questions you might prefer to let go my way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. SIMONAK, for sharing 10 years of experience in the area of justice and home affairs. It's indeed time to open the discussion with the audience, and let us turn first to the persons following the course online if there are any questions, either a hand raised to take the floor, either a question which has been shared on the chat.
Yes, we actually have a question in the chat. He told he preferred to chat it, so the question goes: if I well understood, the solidarity mechanism is mandatory for all member states, but the choice of the type of solidarity is a choice and is therefore not imposed. And the fair share quota per member state is also determined and imposed by the Commission. Is this correct? Maybe one of you can answer me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for this first question. Do we have other questions online or a hand raised?
No, this is the only one.
That's the only one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's then collect 2 or 3 questions from the audience here, and we have one lady there and another one there. So 2 questions here, one on the right with the lady with a gray pull over there. Yes, Marco, you are. Thank you.
Yes, all right. Good evening. First of all, thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you also to the Odysseus, because I think this is a very great opportunity, the one of having such a diverse speaker panel. So my question would be for Ms. DELACOUR. So it's about returns, and I would like to ask, you said that also the idea of increasing returns is also because it would represent eventually a disadvantage for irregular migration. And I would like to ask you, what is the study that the Commission uses to prove this correlation? Because I know that there is a great lack of evidence base that proves that the actual increase in migration will reduce in a certain way migration flows. And it's been kind of a solid critique that has been brought to the Commission. So I would like to know if in the years the Commission have found the chance to validate this position. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have here the lady in the middle. Yes, you have the microphone.
You.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have 2 questions. The first one is related to the critique that some member states see the return sponsorship as relocation through the back door. And I wondered what the mechanisms are, or how you envisage if the pact does come into force, instances of non-compliance after the 8 months point is reached, and the relocation the return having not taken place, a relocation is envisaged. Do you foresee any problems, for instance, if there's a criminality element, or if there's some reason why the person would not be relocated? And are there any mechanisms to make member states comply at that point, seeing that the 2015 proposals, some member states didn't comply? And the second one is potentially just a clarification, but to ask, when you said member states can choose nationalities, is there a possibility that certain member states would only sponsor some nationalities? And given that when we saw the map that had the low rates of return, the lowest rates were in, for instance, Central and West Africa. If member states did not sponsor would-be returnees from those countries, do you envisage people being stuck in limbo somewhere? Is that a possibility? And I hope that's not all too confusing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take maybe one last question, and then we turn to the panelists for their answers and comments. No? Nobody? Okay. So let's see who among the panelists would like to answer and to start.
Shall I start a bit about the more specific ones on return sponsorship? First of all, the question on return and incentives for regular migration. Of course, per definition, the sort of facts on what triggers migration is very complex. There's no. This is why the migration area is not an exact science. We don't have. Everything is individual. Every person that moves for different reasons, and migration is part of the world, and this is the way the world looks. But we can see certain trends, and we can see interplay between incentives and disincentives of various reasons. And I think that it goes without saying that if there is a sort of general knowledge that if you reach the EU, in any case you will never be returned, there will always be the incentive to sort of pay a smuggler and get on a boat and try to reach the European territory, because the return procedures don't work and nobody gets returned. So, you know, there's always going to be this incentive there. We, to my knowledge, at least, are basing this on various information that we get from sort of IOM, from sort of interviewing the migrants that come through these routes. This is a bit the way we base our policy. We work with the agencies. We work with trying to gather as much as information as we possibly can on the reasons why people came, how they came there, what were the sort of trying to understand the mindset. But this is, of course, it's individual, and it's not an exact science. So it's gathered sort of based on operational information that we get from primarily the agencies and also the member states, and a bit, of course, IOM, UNHCR, the way we work with them. So it's based around that. And I think it's also a conceptual thing about how what prospects you might see. There's a lot of migratory flows. You can see a lot happening on social media. You can see immediately when there's a lot of effort in one part where one route, for instance, is closed, then you can see that sort of pressure shifts, because it becomes easier to move through in one place from from one route to another. So I think this is the way we see it. But in sort of, if you're looking for sort of like empirical evidence or a study. This, as with all things in migration, it's not an exact science. So it's based on that kind of conceptual idea, and as we said, part of a package of everything together. So I hope that answers to a certain extent your question. Then moving on to the second question, which was a little bit about the sort of the follow-up after the 8 months, and how, I mean, this will be put down in legislation. So of course this is, I mean, there will be a legal obligation to follow up and to relocate after 8 months. So whether we expect any issues, there might be issues, but we will find a way to deal with them. And this is precisely as well where this return coordinator comes in. This is exactly the kind of thing that if there would be problems later in the process when we come towards the 8 months, this is where the coordinator will need to come in and perhaps put pressure on the member state, make sure that everyone is following up, because it's a whole system that works under the fairness and solidarity. So everyone has to play ball. And I think with all the measures that are there and the way that the pact is designed as a whole, with all the aspects, there is something for everyone in there, and everyone has to play ball. We just have to find the sort of middle way that will help everyone to play ball. On the choice of nationalities, indeed, the member states can choose, but it will be is framed by this migration report, which is a part of the AMR proposal, because it's based, of course, on the needs of the member state that is under pressure. The reason why we want the sponsoring member state to choose the nationalities is because we obviously want that member state to sponsor the nationalities for which they have a reasonable prospect of returning, because the whole idea is that we do want the returns to work. So if member state B is sponsoring member state A for a nationality where they have zero international relations with that third country, or have zero experience with the vulnerability that nationality entails, then that's not going to be much use for the process. And I think with the way the European Union is set up, with the diversity that we have, there is again quite a lot of different aspects in there. Member states do have different expertise, different relations with members, with different third countries that will play into this process. Of course, it will be complex. It's a very complex process, but we do think that this can work. On the ones, yes, there are certain third countries that are not cooperative, and there are certain nationalities that are very difficult to return for various reasons. But this is precisely where it's important to see sponsorship within the context of the wider efforts we're doing at the European level to increase returns, because those nationalities, which will be the very difficult ones, like you mentioned Central Western Africa, those are also the ones that will perhaps be part of the visa leverage process, and who we might put pressure on in a different way, or work more globally at the European Union in order so that will kind of be covered there. But there will always be some where it will be more difficult than others, and that's for sure. But the idea is that all these elements of the pact will work together to sort of make a whole, and that's the idea. I think I covered the ones on sponsorship. I don't know if you want to say on.
I can just respond to the one on the type and level. So member states are always free to choose the type of solidarity measure, and the level of solidarity measures is determined by the fair share for the pressure mechanism. And for the SAR mechanism, it starts as a purely voluntary process where member states put in that they submit a form in which they indicate the type of measure and the level of measure. and the Commission will look at all the forms together, and depending on the gap between the offers and the needs, may revert to a mandatory mechanism where it imposes the fair share level. So that's how it works. And just one word on the obligations, the mandatory character of the solidarity contributions. Once they've been fixed, both in terms of type of measure and level, they will be set out in an implementing act, and that is the way that the Commission can enforce the obligation on the member states. So it will be set out in quite a lot of detail, including on the nationalities for return sponsorship, on the number of returns, and on the type of capacity building or operational support or financial support in the case of the third category of measures.
Thank you. As Florian told me that he has nothing to add for the moment, or is that not correct?
Oh, I mean, my impression was that people have heard enough from academics. Probably the questions are more targeted on the policymakers, so I don't feel that they were directly addressing myself, but we may hear. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So we go back to Mr. SIMONAK for answering one another question or also making comments.
Thank you. I think most of those questions were really targeted at the colleagues from the Commission, because I understood them as seeking more clarity on the Commission's proposals, so I do not feel competent to engage on that. But maybe one remark to underline the choice of nationalities. This was, if I'm not completely mistaken, the Commission's proposals frame this as an option for member states to state their preference. So it is not strictly speaking a choice of which nationalities or migrants member state would be entrusted with. This has been a matter that has been under discussion for a few years, and the plain fact is that Morocco, for instance, has a lot of expertise and actually good results in trying to return Spain has a good position and a good track record in returning Moroccan nationals. Slovakia, for instance, has good prospects to effectuate the return of Ukrainian nationals. That has been historically the case, and it is confirmed by data. So again, the idea that emerged at a certain point was, why don't we use our strengths mutually to help us out? Because there have been years in which Ukrainian nationals were among the leading asylum seekers in France, for instance. And France has had significant difficulties, to my knowledge, actually effectuating those returns. Same goes for citizens of Western Balkans countries, who at some point presented about 1/4, if I'm not mistaken, of asylum seekers in the EU. So maybe it's not an idea that can promise a solution to all ills, but certainly I think it is a fruitful idea when looking for a combination of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So time is over since 10 minutes, but as we have been too long with the presentations, we can maybe ask if you have very quick and precise questions. One question there. Please be as short and precise as you can.
Yeah, thanks all for this discussion. The question I have would be to anyone who feels like answering among the panel members. There was a mention, well, on the Commission side that member states could help other member states also with sort of projects that tackle the root causes of migration in partner countries. I was wondering if there is any sort of course of action or guidelines that the Commission will give in this regard, if member states are completely free to decide on which sort of priorities they want to focus on, or if there are any recommendations in that. That would be the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Somebody else? No, it seems that everybody is tired, and this is absolutely understandable. So, whom of both of you is ready to answer this question?
Yeah, so this third category of capacity building measures, operational support, and measures in the external dimension are determined in the relevant reports of the Commission. So for search and rescue, it's on a yearly basis in what we call the migration management report. And for the member state under pressure, it will be in the pressure report, so where it sets out the assessment of the Commission. And the Commission, on the basis of this assessment of pressure, will also determine the capacity of the member state and its needs. And depending on the needs, it will then determine the solidarity measures. And then member states choose the measures that they want to, the type of measures that they want to contribute to. But so for this third category, the Commission will, together with the member state concerned, determine the various projects. And the projects can be, I mean, it won't be one or two projects, it will obviously be more projects. And as examples that we've already given to the Commission and to the Parliament, it could be funding a project in Libya, for example, if Italy was the benefiting member state. It could be building a reception facility. It could be sending staff, so it could be specialized medical staff, or it could be translators or interpreters. It can be various projects depending on the member state, but one thing that's important is it's over and above what is already provided by the EU agencies. So to come back to the slide that we saw right at the beginning, which was more about the EU solidarity, here we're talking about solidarity between member states, and so it comes over and above what already exists at EU level.
Thank you very much for this answer. Well, I think that this last question shows all the elements that we still have to discover in that complex proposal, and then we will see, of course, what will be the outcome of the legislative process. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for having been here tonight and having accepted to stay quite late today, including, of course, I don't forget Mr. SIMONAK, who is with us online. So thanks a lot in particular also to you. And I wish you a good evening. Tomorrow morning, if you are interested by the PhD seminar, pay attention that we start at 9:30 instead of 10, because we have 4 presentations. So we decided to start a little bit earlier. The French group can enjoy a free afternoon till 5 o'clock with the course on reception conditions. Donc